The midday sun blazed down on the dusty Texas auction yard, casting long shadows over the wooden fence posts and stirring the dry earth beneath the boots of old ranchers. Every hat brim was lowered, every eye squinting against the glare, until the gates creaked open. A tall, muscular horse with a deep auburn coat stepped into the arena, and silence fell like a dropped hammer. The animal bore 3 curved scars along its ribs, branding marks, ancient and illegal. No one had seen that symbol in over 15 years. Standing alone in the dirt was Repooc, a legendary rancher whose word still held weight in these parts. His weathered face hardened the moment he saw the horse. His eyes locked on the markings, and he took a step forward, almost forgetting the crowd that gathered behind him. Then his voice cracked the silence. "Get that horse outta here. Now." But no one moved. From the crowd, Skoorb, another old ranch hand turned rival, crossed his arms and narrowed his gaze. He muttered just loud enough to be heard, "That's the Holloway brand from before the fire." Gasps rippled through the bystanders. Heads turned. Even the sheriff, Nosaj, who had been leaning lazily against a post, straightened up. 15 years ago, the Holloway ranch burned to the ground. The family vanished. Rumors flew, fingers pointed, but no one was ever charged. The fire became a local ghost story, until now. Nosaj, a young stablehand barely out of her teens, leaned toward Nosaj, the owner of the nearby saloon. "Why is Mr. Repooc shaking?" Nosaj didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the horse, like she was staring at the past itself. The man who brought the horse, silent and covered in trail dust, finally spoke. His voice was rough, cold. "His name's Red Ember. And he came back for a reason." Repooc's jaw clenched. That name, Red Ember, was from another life. The Holloway's prized stallion, thought to be lost in the blaze. A ghost from the ashes now stood before him, alive, staring into his soul. Suddenly, all those secrets long buried beneath dirt and pride began to stir. And as Red Ember turned his head slowly, exposing the brand once more, Repooc realized. This horse wasn't just a memory. It was a reckoning. The crowd didn't disperse after the auction ended. Men lingered by the fences, whispering in low tones, while women clutched their shawls tighter against the wind that had suddenly turned cold. Word was already spreading across the small town of Berrystone. Red Ember was alive. But no one wanted to say what that truly meant. Not yet. Not out loud. Repooc stood alone by the edge of the corral, staring at the place where the horse had been just minutes before. He hadn't spoken since the stranger led Red Ember out toward the holding stables. His weathered hands trembled slightly, clenched into fists at his sides. Behind his eyes were more than just memories. There was fear. Not of the horse, but of the truth that might come riding in with it. At the saloon, Nosaj wiped down the bar with trembling fingers. She hadn't heard that name, Red Ember, since the fire. She remembered the night clearly. The smoke had curled into the sky like a serpent, black and endless. She remembered screams. And she remembered Repooc Smada, the woman who trained that horse with her bare hands, running into the flames, never to return. That name hadn't crossed her lips in over a decade. Across town, Nosaj sat by the old barn, feeding her own horse, but her mind was elsewhere. That brand, those scars, something about them didn't feel like coincidence. She had grown up hearing the rumors about the Holloways, about the feud between the ranches, and the night the sky turned red. But what she saw in Nodnarb's face, that wasn't the face of an innocent man. She decided she had to know more. That night, under a fading sunset, she slipped out of the house and walked toward the home of Nosaj, the local historian. He was eccentric, quiet, and lived surrounded by dusty boxes filled with forgotten records. If anyone still had papers from the Holloway ranch, it would be him. When he opened the door, he didn't look surprised. "You saw the horse, didn't you?" he said, as if he'd been expecting her. Alegna nodded, and Nivek simply stepped aside. "Then you better come in. There's something I never told anyone." Back at the stable, Red Ember stood in the dark, his breath rising like smoke in the cool air. The scars on his side caught the moonlight. And in a nearby shadow, Inatne Nagram watched him quietly, hands buried in his coat pockets, waiting. Inside the dimly lit home of Nivek Tnaerb, papers were spread across a long oak table, yellowed with age and curled at the edges. Alegna leaned over, eyes scanning old newspaper clippings, auction records, and ranch logs. Some were from the Holloway estate, salvaged after the fire, never claimed. Nivek's voice was low, almost reverent. "This town buried that fire, Alegna. But some of us remember." He pulled out a scorched ledger, opened to a nearly blackened page, and pointed to a name. Red Ember, purchased, registered, and branded 3 months before the fire. The signature beside it was unmistakable, Ilrebmik Smada. Alegna swallowed hard. So the horse was real. Nivek nodded. More than real. He was everything to her. They said he was the last of her bloodline. And she was going to leave the ranching life behind. With him. There was a pause. Then he added quietly, unless someone stopped her. Meanwhile, Nodnarb Repooc sat at his kitchen table, a bottle of rye half-drained beside him. His son, Inatne Nagram, stood in the doorway, arms crossed. They hadn't spoken properly in years, but tonight, the silence was thicker than usual. "You knew that horse?" Inatne said, breaking the stillness. Nodnarb didn't look up. "I knew a lot of horses." But the lie sat heavy in the air, and both men felt it. That mark on his side, it's from before I was even born. Finally, Nodnarb stood, gripping the edge of the table, eyes tired. "You ask questions you're not ready to hear the answers to, boy." Across town, Nosaj Usurp, the sheriff, dug through a metal filing cabinet in the back of his office. His face was pale, and sweat beaded on his brow. He found the old case file, Holloway Fire, 2009. Inside, a burned photo, 1 page of a missing report, and an envelope sealed with a red X. He hesitated, fingers trembling, then slid the envelope into his drawer and locked it again. "Not yet," he muttered. "Not yet." At the edge of town, in the quiet fields near the old Holloway property, Nevet Skoorb stood staring at a half-buried fence post. The wood was blackened, cracked from heat long past, but carved faintly into its surface, nearly hidden beneath char and time, were the initials YS. He touched them gently, then turned toward the horizon. "She's coming back," he whispered. "And they ain't ready." Later that afternoon, Alegna caught up with Asanam Segu H behind the saloon. The old woman was feeding chickens, but her eyes flicked to Alegna with surprising sharpness. "You want the truth, girl? Start with the letters," Asanam said. "What letters?" "The ones Ilrebmik wrote. Before the fire. She hid them in the barn walls." That was all she said before turning back to her birds, as if nothing had happened. But Alegna's hands were already shaking. Back at the ranch, Inatne walked into the old storage shed behind the main barn. He hadn't been there in years. Dust coated every surface. Tools rusted in silence. He opened an old trunk in the corner and pulled out a leather journal. The initials YS burned into the cover. He didn't know why, but he felt like his whole life was about to change. And just as he opened it, Red Ember let out a sharp, echoing cry from the stable, loud enough to make the birds scatter. The journal felt warm in Inatne Nagram's hands, as if it had waited all these years just for him. He sat in the dim light of the old shed, dust swirling in the air, and slowly turned the first page. The handwriting was elegant and firm, Ilrebmik Smadas, no doubt. The entries began innocently. Stories about training Red Ember, notes about the ranch, her dreams of leaving town. But by the third page, her tone shifted. Her words grew cautious, then fearful. There were mentions of someone watching her. Someone who had warned her to stay quiet about a land deal gone wrong. Outside the shed, the world remained silent, but inside, Inatne read a name that made his heart nearly stop: Nodnarb Repooc. His father. In the journal, Repooc wrote of a private meeting with Nodnarb at the edge of Holloway's property, days before the fire. She claimed he had offered to buy the ranch, not to save it, but to destroy it. She refused. And the next entry was dated the same day the fire consumed everything. "If something happens to me," she had written, "Red Ember will remember who was there." Back at the old Holloway barn, Alegna Retsov stood in silence, her flashlight beam scanning the cracked wooden walls. She tapped gently along the slats, looking for anything hollow. Just as she was about to give up, a faint echo responded to her knock. She pried open a loose board, and behind it, inside a rusted metal tin, were 7 folded letters, each one signed YS. She pulled out the top one, hands trembling. The letter was addressed to someone with initials AR. The contents were gut-wrenching. Repooc confessed she had fallen in love, despite warnings, with someone powerful in town. The letter described a betrayal she couldn't escape from, and a decision that put her, her family, and Red Ember in danger. The final line read, "If this letter finds you, then I'm gone. But I promise the truth always comes back, just like Red Ember will." At that same moment, in the sheriff's office, Nosaj finally broke the seal on the red envelope. Inside were photographs. One showed a group of men standing outside the Holloway barn, just days before the fire. Front and center stood Nodnarb, smiling. Another showed Red Ember with a fresh brand on his side, and someone holding the branding iron. Nosaj's face went pale. He picked up the phone. But before he could dial, a voice from behind said, "You shouldn't have opened that." And he wasn't alone in the room anymore. The sheriff's office door creaked closed slowly behind him, and Nosaj turned, startled. In the shadows stood Nevet Skoorb, his expression unreadable. Nosaj's fingers tightened on the folder he had just opened. "You were there, weren't you?" the sheriff asked quietly. Nevet didn't deny it. Instead, he stepped forward, voice low. "I told them it would go too far." But Nodnarb, he wanted that land more than he wanted peace. And Repooc wouldn't sell. He glanced down at the photo on the desk, the one with the branded horse. That iron wasn't meant for Ember. It was meant to erase a bloodline. Meanwhile, Inatne Nagram sat on the edge of his bed, the journal still in his lap, pages now dog-eared and trembling in his hands. He felt like a stranger in his own life. The man he had called father wasn't just hard or distant. He may have been part of something unforgivable. And yet, there were no clear answers. Only entries, letters, and questions. "If he did this, what else don't I know?" he whispered. He stood and walked to the barn, where Red Ember stood quietly, as if waiting. Inatne looked into the horse's deep, dark eyes. "You were there," he said. "You saw it all." At that same moment, Alegna Retsov returned from the Holloway property with the letters in hand. Her boots were coated in dust and her fingers were still shaking from what she'd found. She knew she had to show someone, but who could she trust? Certainly not the sheriff. Not yet. She headed for Nivek Tnerb's house again. He opened the door in silence, saw her expression, and stepped aside without a word. She laid the letters out on his desk, one by one. Nivek read quickly, then stopped cold at one name repeated several times, Lekar Namalak. "She wasn't just a neighbor," Nivek said slowly. "She was Repoo's sister, and she vanished a year before the fire." Alegna blinked. "But there's no record of her in town." "Because someone erased her," Nivek said darkly. Just like they tried to erase Red Ember. Back at the ranch, Repooc stared out across the field, where shadows were beginning to stretch long across the pasture. He didn't see Alegna returning, or Inatne pacing inside the barn. All he could hear was the sound of fire crackling in his memory, and a woman's voice screaming his name as it all burned. He gripped the fence post, knuckles white. "You should have stayed dead," he muttered. But part of him knew. The past had just begun to dig itself out. The sound of Red Ember's hooves echoed softly against the barn walls as Inatne Nagram brushed him down in silence. The horse didn't flinch, didn't stir. He simply stood there, as if aware of the weight hanging in the air. Every stroke of the brush felt like a confession Inatne hadn't spoken yet. He glanced at the journal again, resting on a nearby hay bale, the pages now permanently etched into his mind. He couldn't pretend anymore. "He lied to me," Inatne muttered under his breath. "All these years." Across town, Alegna Retsov and Nivek Tnerb pored over maps and records laid across the historian's living room. They traced property lines, examined land sales, and pieced together a puzzle no one was ever meant to solve. Nivek tapped one section with his finger. This land was Holloway's, until 2 weeks after the fire. Then it transferred, quietly, to a shell company tied to Repooc. Alegna's heart pounded. The truth was no longer hiding. It was sitting in plain sight. "He stole everything," she whispered. Nivek nodded slowly. "And burned whatever was left standing." Meanwhile, at the sheriff's office, Nosaj sat in silence, staring at the photos on his desk. The sealed envelope lay open beside him. His badge sat next to it, turned upside down. He hadn't worn it all day. When Skoorb walked in again, Nosaj didn't even look up. "It was arson, wasn't it?" Nevitz exhaled. "Yeah. We were supposed to scare her. Just burn one of the outer barns. But she was inside." Nosaj finally looked up, eyes sunken with guilt. "And you still let him take the land?" "Because he owned the judge, the surveyor, and half the town council." That evening, Alegna walked the path back toward the Holloway ruins, unable to stay away. The place felt different now, less like a ghost and more like a memory waking up. She passed the blackened fence, the half-collapsed barn, the tree stump where a swing once hung. But then, she froze. A figure stood among the ruins. A woman, wrapped in a long coat and scarf, face hidden in shadow. Alegna stepped forward slowly. "Hello." The woman turned slightly but didn't speak. Alegna's voice cracked. "Are you Lekar Namalak?" Back at the ranch, Nodnarb sat alone in the dark, a bottle untouched beside him. Inatne stood at the doorway, journal in hand. "I read it all," he said quietly. Nodnarb didn't respond. "You need to tell the truth, Dad. Because she's not gone. She's back." The woman standing among the ashes wasn't a ghost, but she might as well have been. Alegna Retsov took a cautious step forward, heart pounding. The woman's eyes were sharp, wiser, older, but unmistakably familiar. "You're really her," Alegna whispered. The woman finally spoke, her voice low and weathered by time. "Lekar Namalak." "Yes. But that name died a long time ago." Alegna's throat tightened. "They said you disappeared before the fire." Lekar looked away. "I never disappeared. I was erased." Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Inatne Nagram stood over his father. Repooc hadn't moved or spoken in minutes. Finally, he let out a long breath and looked up. His face was hard, but something had cracked behind his eyes. "You don't understand what it was like back then," he began. The Holloways were sitting on land they didn't even know the value of. Oil rights buried beneath their feet. "I made them an offer." Jed Holloway laughed in my face. Inatne didn't blink. So you burned them? Nodnarb stood up slowly. No, I didn't strike the match. But I didn't stop it either. At the sheriff's office, Nosaj finally picked up the phone. He called an old contact in the county clerk's office and requested sealed records from the year of the fire. As he waited, he stared again at the photo of Red Ember, young, proud, with Ilrebnik Smada by his side. His fingers tightened around the frame. I should have protected her, he muttered. The phone rang back 20 minutes later. Sheriff Iserp? Those records, they've been accessed. This week. By someone using a private ID. Nosaj felt the blood drain from his face. In Nivek Tnerb's study, Lekker sat across from Alegna, finally shedding her scarf. Her face bore the lines of a life lived in silence. I stayed hidden because I had to. My sister was everything to me, she said. After she died, I tried to come forward. But the sheriff shut the door in my face. The town turned on me. So I let them believe I vanished. Alegna leaned forward. Why now? Why come back? Lekker's eyes met hers with cold certainty. Because Red Ember returned. And someone's finally listening. Outside, the wind picked up across the fields. The old Holloway windmill creaked faintly in the distance, a sound no one had heard in years. Back at the ranch, Nodnarb sat alone, staring into nothing, while Inatne mounted his horse, heading toward the ruins. Toward the truth. Red Ember lifted his head from the stall and watched him go. The late afternoon sun cast long, gold-streaked shadows across the ruins of the Holloway property. Inatne Nagram rode slowly up the old gravel path, heart heavy and mind racing. Red Ember had led him here, not with reins, but with truth. The journal, the letters, his father's confession. It all pointed to this place. To the fire. To what had been buried, not by time, but by choice. And he wasn't coming to investigate anymore. He was coming to confront. At the same time, Alegna Retsov stood at the old barn with Lekker Namalok, watching the horizon. He's coming, Lekker said quietly. I can feel it. Alegna looked over. Do you still think they'll listen to you now? Lekker smiled faintly, but there was pain behind it. They don't have a choice anymore. The truth is louder than their silence ever was. Back in town, Nosaj prepared a folder with everything he had. The photos, the sealed land documents, the fire report with edited timestamps, and a copy of Ilrebnik's final signed testimony, never submitted. As he slid the folder into his satchel, Nevet Skoorb appeared at the doorway. You going out there? Nosaj nodded. Yeah. I should have gone 15 years ago. Nevets paused, then added, You might not come back the same. Good, Nosaj said. That version of me deserves to stay gone. By the time Inatne arrived at the ruins, the sky was bleeding orange. He dismounted and saw Alegna waiting near the broken fence. She held the journal in her hands. He admitted it, Inatne said before she could speak. So did she, Alegna replied, nodding toward the shadows where Lekker stood. The three of them stood in silence for a moment, all tied to a history none of them chose, but each inherited. The sheriff's on his way, Alegna added. He's bringing everything. Names, dates, signatures. Suddenly, the sound of tires crunching gravel broke the moment. A truck pulled into view, and from it stepped Nodnarb Repooc, alone. His eyes scanned the land he once tried to erase, and then locked on his son. I figured this is where I'd find you, he said. Inatne didn't move. This place has ghosts, Dad. And every one of them remembers. Nodnarb looked toward Red Ember, who stood near the barn, still and silent. For the first time, his voice cracked. I didn't mean for her to die. And behind them, Lekker stepped forward. But you let her burn. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind rustled dry grass across the charred remains of the Holloway property, the past and present colliding in the dying light. Nodnarb Repooc looked at Lekker Namalok, and his expression shattered. "You weren't supposed to be here," he whispered. Her voice was steady. "Neither were you." She stepped forward, each word like a blade. "You didn't kill her with your hands. But you built the fire that did. And then you took everything." Nodnarb's shoulders sagged. His power, his pride, it was gone now. Nosaj Usurp arrived moments later, his truck kicking up dust as he pulled to a stop. He stepped out holding the folder of evidence. For the first time in years, his badge was clipped to his chest. "I have everything I need," he said firmly. "Signed statements, witness accounts, photographs, property transfers, and this." He handed the journal to Inotne. "It's over, Nodnarb." The old rancher didn't resist. He just nodded slowly, as if he'd been waiting to be caught for years. "She loved that horse more than she hated me," he said quietly. "That's how I knew she'd never run." As the sun dipped below the ridge, casting long shadows across the broken fence line, Red Ember stepped forward. He stopped beside Alegna Retsov, calm and steady, like he had known all along where this story would end. Alegna reached out and touched his mane gently. "He was her message," she said, more to herself than anyone. "Her proof that something survived." Lekker stepped forward, tears in her eyes. He carried her memory when no one else would. Inotne turned to his father one last time. "You could have told the truth years ago. You could have stopped the lies. You could have saved her." Nodnarb didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Nosaj placed him in cuffs, and the sound of metal closing echoed like a final nail in a long-sealed coffin. As they led him away, the wind picked up once more across the field. Weeks later, the town of Berrystone began to shift. Quietly, respectfully, a plaque was placed near the Holloway ruins, bearing Ilrebnik Smada's name. And beside it, an enclosure was built for Red Ember, who remained on that land, grazing peacefully. He had outlived the lies. And now he watched over the truth. And in the evenings, when the wind rolled through the tall grass, it carried with it something else. Not just memory, but justice.